It was meant to be an ordinary crossing, a short evening hop across the English Channel. Families, lorry drivers, day trippers, all settling into their seats thinking about home or the weekend ahead. But just minutes after leaving the Belgian port of Zeebrugge, the Herald of Free Enterprise would be fighting for her life, and losing. In less than 2 minutes, laughter turned into screams, light into darkness, and hope was replaced by horror. 193 lives would be claimed in a tragedy so swift, so avoidable, that it shook the very foundations of maritime safety. This is not just the story of a ship that capsized. It is the story of warnings ignored, complacency turned to catastrophe, and the extraordinary courage of those who faced the freezing water and their fight to survive. The English Channel, the thin stretch of water dividing England from continental Europe, looks deceptively small on a map. At its narrowest point it can be swum, but the 38 miles between Dover and Calais is still a challenging crossing and one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. For decades, ferries carried foot passengers eager to wander the streets of northern France. Then, in the 1920s, the first car ferries appeared, allowing motorists to take their vehicles across. After the Second World War, demand exploded. Technology raced ahead. Gone were the days of cranes hoisting cars aboard. Purpose-built vessels emerged, designed so drivers could roll straight on at one end and straight off at the other. The roll-on, roll-off ferry, or Ro-Ro, had arrived. In the late 1970s, European Ferries plc ordered 3 modern roll-on, roll-off ferries for the fiercely competitive Dover to Calais route. Built in Germany by Schichau Unterweser AG, the Spirit of Free Enterprise, Pride of Free Enterprise, and Herald of Free Enterprise were designed for speed, rapid acceleration, and quick turnaround in port, a hallmark of the Townsend Torreson brand. Launched in late 1979, the Herald of Free Enterprise was an 8-deck Ro-Ro ferry. Beneath the waterline, H-deck housed machinery, fuel and water tanks and some passenger cabins. Above it was G-deck, the main vehicle deck, stretching the full length of the ship and accessed at the bow by 2 massive weathertight doors and at the stern by one even larger. When closed, they sealed the ship from the sea. When open, they could swallow lorries whole. Above G-deck sat F-deck, a mezzanine car deck with crew quarters to either side. E-deck was another full vehicle deck, while D-deck formed a suspended level for additional cars. The upper decks were for passengers. C-deck contained shops, bars, lounges and restaurants. B-deck offered more lounges, dining areas and crew mess rooms. A-deck housed the officers and radio room, with the bridge perched between A and B. The Herald was an all-welded steel vessel, and the 2 vast vehicle decks, G and E, allowed simultaneous loading at Dover and Calais via double link spans. The bow and stern doors on G-deck, sealed by heavy neoprene gaskets, were all that stood between the sea and the ship's interior. It was capable of carrying 1,400 passengers and weighed 7,951 gross tons. A crew of 80 worked against the clock to clean, unload and reload between crossings. On the 6th of March 1987, a £1 ticket promotion run by the Sun newspaper swelled passenger numbers, making the turnaround more hectic than usual for the already overworked staff. And many of the passengers boarding at Zeebrugge for the trip back to Dover had taken advantage of that offer. Amongst them were Michael and Maureen Bennett with their daughter Teresa and her fiancé Mark. Teresa had planned the trip to celebrate her parents' wedding anniversary. Simon Osborne and his friends had spent their day on a bar crawl around Ostend. Commercial freight was the lifeblood of the ferry trade, and truck drivers made up a large share of the passengers. Their rest was a priority. Cabins were allocated to them first, ensuring that they could sleep during the crossing. Only if a driver declined would the cabin be offered to other travellers. Exactly how many people boarded that evening and who they were would prove difficult to establish. The operators, Townsend Torreson, kept no complete passenger list. Vehicle registration numbers were noted, but only the drivers' names were recorded. Following the loading of cars and lorries, ensuring that the Herald's bow doors were properly closed depended exclusively on human vigilance. There were no bridge indicators, no alarms, and no direct line of sight from the wheelhouse to the bow. The only confirmation the captain received came from the crew member responsible for closing the doors. This flaw was no secret. In 1983, the Pride of Free Enterprise twice sailed with her bow doors open after the duty seaman fell asleep. Captains pushed for simple bridge indicators, but management's response was dismissive. But the request resurfaced in 1986 and was rejected again. By 1987, the Herald was operating between Dover and Zeebrugge in Belgium, a port with just a single link span. At high tide, it couldn't reach the upper car deck and so couldn't properly accommodate double-deck loading. The workaround was crude but effective. They would flood the bow ballast tanks to lower the vessel until E-deck aligned with the ramp. On the 6th of March 1987, that adjustment was never reversed before departure. At berth 12, the bow doors stood wide open as the last vehicles boarded. The duty of closing them fell to Assistant Boatswain Mark Stanley. But after tidying the deck, he went to his cabin and fell asleep. First Officer Leslie Sable, tasked with ensuring that they were shut, left the area believing Stanley was on his way back. Boatswain Terence Ayling, also nearby, did nothing, later insisting it was not his responsibility. By the time loading was complete, she was running 5 minutes behind schedule. From the bridge, Captain David Lurie had no view of the bow, but assuming the doors were closed, he ordered the Herald out of Zeebrugge, a harbour tug guiding the turn. Once clear, the ferry increased its speed from 5 knots in the channel to 18 knots as she passed the outer mole, heading for Dover and into disaster. As the Herald accelerated into Zeebrugge's shallow harbour, another hidden danger emerged: the squat effect. The pressure drop beneath the moving hull pulled the vessel even lower into the water, and with her bow doors still wide open, it was only a matter of minutes before catastrophe struck. At 19:24, just clear of the outer mole, seawater surged through the open doors, spilling across the car deck. With no weather-tight bulkheads, the free surface effect took over, the shifting weight of water rapidly destroying stability. 2 minutes later, the Herald began to heel sharply to port, 30 degrees in seconds. On the bridge, Captain Lurie had time to shout, "What's going on here?" and tried to execute an emergency stop before the ship rolled. He was thrown 40 feet, a little over 12 metres, from the starboard side of the bridge to the port side, and the windows smashed to let the freezing waters of the channel in. I tried to get back to the VHF radio, but I was unable to. I was thrown across the bridge and I must have blacked out. The next thing I knew, I was floating. She briefly righted herself before rolling again, this time onto her side. The entire capsize lasted barely 90 seconds. Witnesses nearby quickly reported the sinking to port authorities. Inside, chaos was instant. Water entered the engine room and knocked out both her main and backup electricity systems, plunging the ship into darkness. Passengers were hurled through collapsing interiors, walls became floors, and floors became walls. In the freezing water, many drowned almost immediately, and others were crushed by falling interior furniture and equipment. Peter was at the duty-free counter when the first jolt came. A woman behind me started screaming. I thought she was overreacting. And then a more violent jolt shook the ship, and almost instantly she capsized. I slid across the lounge floor until I hit the bar, which had gone from vertical to horizontal. Everything not bolted down came crashing through the air. People were somersaulting from one side of the ship to the other. One man smashed through a glass panel just feet from me, and then the lights went out, and I was swept up by a freezing wave that smashed through the doors and windows. I thought I was going to die. The ship came to rest on a sandbank barely a kilometre from shore. Sheer luck that kept her from sinking completely. Hundreds were trapped inside, clinging to air pockets in the freezing dark, praying rescue would outrun the rising tide. A glass partition in the cafeteria abruptly became a deadly barrier to escape. Michael Reynolds, who was trapped there, remembered. There was no more than 18 inches of air, and I remember thinking if we go any deeper, then, that's it. Another passenger banged his fists on the glass and desperately tried to punch his way through it. He dislocated all the fingers in his right hand. Helicopters, Navy craft and local boats converged in a frantic race against time, their crews painfully aware of the odds. Yet they worked for hours in darkness, smashing windows, pulling survivors to safety and improvising escape routes. Amid the chaos, there were notable moments of heroism. Larry O'Brien braved the icy waters and chaos, pulling at least 30 people to safety, despite being unable to swim. He risked his own life every time. And there was Michael Skippen, a head waiter who faced a different kind of heroism. Trapped in the rapidly flooding restaurant, he stayed behind to help others escape the submerged chaos. His selfless actions cost him his life, but countless others owe their survival to his courage in those desperate moments. Teresa Bennett remembered how equipment that was supposed to save them made survival more difficult. She said, "The life jackets came down from above us, as if a cupboard or something had opened suddenly. Ironically, there were so many life jackets that many people were having even more difficulty trying to find space to move. It does seem that the life jackets in these circumstances gave added difficulties. Everyone was tangled up in the straps." Some of the Herald's own crew became the first rescuers. Boatswain Terry Ayling fought his way to the bridge where he found able seaman Tony Down and quartermaster Tom Wilson. Together they lowered a line hauling Captain Lurie, Chief Officer Leslie Sable and Second Officer Paul Morter to safety. From a lifeboat they retrieved a flare, firing it to signal the approaching tugboats, and then armed themselves with hammers, axes and ropes and went in search of survivors. A handful of passengers, thrown onto the starboard deck as the ship rolled, had been able to scramble onto the exposed hull, but most were still trapped inside. "What I will never forget," Ayling recalled, "is having to walk on the windows. It was like a scene out of a horror film set in an asylum. We were walking on people's faces and fists hammering at the windows. The rescuers signalled for those inside to move back, then smashed the glass, careful to avoid showering the desperate faces on the other side, and then they began pulling people out." About an hour after the Herald capsized, the first rescue divers entered the ship, risking their own lives amongst the debris to search for survivors. One rescue diver, Pete Lagaste, later said, "With the lights, we saw that the people in the water were moving. We also saw people in the water who were motionless, who had probably died. But we went for the people who were moving, who put up their arms or called, because you know these people are still alive." Amongst those he pulled from the water was 14-year-old Nicola Simpson. She had spent 2.5 hours in the water next to her mother's body. "3 times I lifted Nicola Simpson out, and twice she slipped from me at the last moment. The 3rd time I had to push her step by step up the ladder before me to make sure she wouldn't fall back in the water again." Now, she was evacuated by helicopter, but at that point she was clinically dead. Through remarkable fortune and the hard work of the medical staff involved, she was resuscitated and was later reunited with her father. Despite the growing darkness and the rising tide, the rescue effort went on long into the night. Almost 7 hours after the Herald capsized, the last 3 survivors, Brian Gibbons, Joe Calderwood and Roger Broomfield, truck drivers who had been trapped in one of the cabins on H deck, were located and winched up to safety. Recovery operations continued through until Saturday night, although all they found was bodies. Eventually, deteriorating weather meant that the search had to be called off. The remaining bodies would not be retrieved until the weather allowed salvage operations to begin. The temperature that night hovered around -5 degrees C, that's 23 degrees Fahrenheit, and anyone plunged into the freezing water was in immediate danger of hypothermia. Strong currents and the ship's precarious position made every rescue attempt harder. For many, help arrived too late. The tide, relentless and indifferent, claimed lives even after the capsize was over. Within 15 minutes of the first distress call, 35 ambulances lined the harbour, Red Cross workers ready with blankets. To avoid overwhelming any one hospital, the injured were sent by rotation to different medical centres. Provincial Governor Olivier Van Est, who coordinated much of the rescue, explained the strict measures in place that night. On medical advice, no one was to remain on the quay for more than 60 seconds in such temperatures. We had 35 ambulances and 2 mobile medical units. But what of those unhurt? There were far more than I planned, so I sent police to the railway station to clear passengers from city buses and send them to the docks. Drastic, yes, but I don't think the people of Zeebrugge will complain. They did not. The town rallied. Crisis centres were flooded with offers of clothing, hotels gave free rooms and even drove survivors in their own cars, while some fishing boat crews who had taken part in the rescue brought those they'd saved straight into their own homes to get warm and dry. But confusion reigned. Many survivors had been separated from loved ones during the capsize or rescue, and without a proper passenger list, reuniting families and identifying the dead was painfully slow. Reporters from major British news outlets descended on the scene, some even climbing onto the Herald's hull while the rescue was still underway. Others crowded survivors in shelters, hungry for details. At St Jan's Hospital, survivor Rosina Summerfield searched desperately for a phone to call her mother in England. The hospital receptionist told her the lines were jammed. British press calls were blocking incoming messages. One BBC caller promised to contact her mother, but only if she recounted what happened. Rosina agreed, not realising her words would be broadcast. Her mother saw the interview before ever receiving a direct call. Many families learned of the disaster in the same way, through the media. The ferry's operator, Townsend Torreson, often provided no information or worse, gave the wrong news. The family of crewman Ian Lawson were told he was alive in hospital, then that he was missing, even as his name still appeared on survivor lists. His mother-in-law described it as like being on a seesaw you can't get off. Some families endured press intrusion while waiting for updates. Tracy Edwards, whose parents, grandmother, sister and baby nephew were aboard, recalled reporters following her into a toilet and even sliding a microphone boom under the door. When relatives asked for a television, staff bought one, along with a stack of videos, including the 1972 disaster film The Poseidon Adventure. The sight of it sparked a furious debate over who would be first to destroy the tape. The Herald had succumbed not to storm or collision, but to a chain of small human errors that combined into one of Britain's worst peacetime maritime disasters. By night's end, 193 people were dead, the youngest just 23 days old. On the day afterwards, Townsend Torreson's Deputy Chief Public Relations Officer, Paul Ovington, said, "We don't know the cause of the accident. We are holding our own investigation, but it will be for the official Department of Transport inquiry to establish the reason." However, for those on the scene, there was already a very large and obvious clue as to the cause. As the Herald of Free Enterprise lay half submerged on her side, the bow doors were clearly wide open. Several of the survivors were able to confirm this. Rosina Summerfield had seen the doors open when she and her friend returned to their car, which was near the ferry doors. She said, "I remember being fascinated by the fact that the water was the same level as the floor, and it was like a massive infinity pool." The official report said, "From the outset, Mr. Mark Victor Stanley, who was the assistant boatswain, has accepted that it was his duty to close the bow doors at the time of the departure from Zeebrugge, and that he failed to carry out this duty. Mr. Stanley had opened the bow doors on arrival in Zeebrugge. Thereafter he was engaged in supervising members of the crew in maintenance and cleaning the ship until he was released from work by the boatswain, Mr. Ayling. Mr. Stanley then went to his cabin, where he fell asleep and was not awakened by the call, 'Harbour Stations', which was given over the tannoy address system. He remained asleep on his bunk until he was thrown out of it when the Herald began to capsize. Mr. Stanley has frankly recognised his failure to turn up for duty, and he will, no doubt, suffer remorse for a very long time to come. If the company regards it as appropriate or necessary to take disciplinary action against Mr. Stanley, it has the power to do so under the Code of Conduct for the Merchant Navy. In fairness to Mr. Stanley, it is right to record that after the Herald capsized, he found his way out of the ship onto her hull, where he set about rescuing passengers trapped inside. He broke a window for access, and, when he was scooping the glass away, his right forearm was deeply cut. Nevertheless, he re-entered the hull and went into the water to assist passengers. He continued until he was overcome by cold and bleeding. Boatswain Terry Ayling would later tell the court he believed he was the last crewman on the vehicle deck. He'd stretched a chain across the open bow doors, a token barrier, but hadn't closed them. That, he said, had never been part of his duties, nor was it his responsibility to check if anyone else had done it. The man who was responsible, Chief Officer Leslie Sable, faced an impossible task. He was expected to oversee the closing of the bow doors and be on the bridge for departure, 2 places at once. In his testimony, Sable recalled thinking he'd seen Assistant Boatswain Mark Stanley at the doors before leaving for the bridge, or at least he'd seen someone in that area. It was a fatal assumption. The captain carried ultimate responsibility for everything that happened on board, but from the bridge he had no way of knowing if the bow doors were shut. The ship's design made them almost impossible to see, and there were no indicator lights to confirm their position. He simply had to trust that the job had been done. And perhaps, in his mind, it wasn't unthinkable to sail with them open, because it had happened before. 4 years earlier, the Herald's sister ship, Pride of Free Enterprise, had left Dover with her bow doors wide open. The reason? The assistant boatswain had also been asleep. That vessel had made the entire crossing to Zeebrugge in that state, and somehow nothing happened. So why had the Pride of Free Enterprise survived her own open bow doors crossing, when the Herald had not? One of the biggest differences came down to the place of departure. The Herald normally sailed Dover to Calais, not Zeebrugge. But Zeebrugge's link span ramp wasn't long enough to reach E-deck, the upper vehicle deck. To make it work, the ferry had to sit lower in the water. The captain ordered the ballast tanks filled so vehicles could drive aboard. Draining them again would take at least 90 minutes, time they didn't have, and so the Herald left the harbour still riding lower than usual. But ballast alone wasn't the whole story. Even when loaded down, the bow doors normally sat a good 10 or 11 feet above the sea. At Zeebrugge there was another problem: shallow water. To see just how dangerous that was, investigators ran a full-scale test. They used the Pride of Free Enterprise, same design as the Herald, and recreated the crossing. Investigators turned to the Pride of Free Enterprise, a sister ship built to the same design as the Herald. They staged a full-scale recreation of the fatal crossing. Cameras were mounted at the bow. This time the doors were sealed shut. At first the bow wave seemed harmless, but as the ship accelerated, the change was sudden. The crest surged upwards, 4 meters high, driven by the squat effect. Normally crews would ease off the power, but in this trial they didn't, just as the Herald hadn't that night, perhaps in a rush to claw back lost minutes. The result was clear. Water forced its way onto the vast car deck. With no bulkheads to stop it, the free surface effect took hold. The weight of that shifting flood was enough to roll a ship onto her side, just as it had doomed the Herald of Free Enterprise. The ship came to rest on a sandbank, preventing her from rolling completely inverted. The disaster drove immediate design changes. On the Pride and Spirit of Free Enterprise and other ferries like them, movable barriers were added to vehicle decks to limit how far floodwater could travel. Scuppers and side vents were fitted to let water drain away. They wouldn't make such a ship unsinkable, but they could slow a flood, buying precious minutes. And minutes can mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The inquiry wasn't just about finding blame. It was about making sure this never happened again. First came the most obvious fix. The Herald's captain had no way of knowing from the bridge whether his bow doors were open or closed. That blind spot was closed forever. Every ship of her type would now carry indicator lights on the bridge, showing the exact status of the doors. And CCTV would back it up, giving officers a direct view without leaving their posts. But the recommendations didn't stop there. The rescue had exposed other deadly flaws. Too many passengers were left in darkness when the power failed. Too many struggled to put on life jackets in the chaos, and too many were trapped behind toughened glass windows, with rescuers forced to smash their way in before anyone could get out. The changes would be written into new safety standards, hard lessons learned, paid for in the lives lost aboard the Herald of Free Enterprise. The inquiry didn't just point the finger at the bridge crew. Yes, the captain and chief officer had their certificates suspended, but other crew were negligent too. Justice Sheen found all 3 deckhands played a part in the negligence. Stanley for abandoning his post, Sable for leaving the doors unattended, and Ayling for failing to report the doors being open. But his report went further. condemning the company itself for fostering what he described as a disease of sloppiness and negligence at every level of the corporation's hierarchy. But investigators saw a far deeper problem. In their words, the underlying cardinal faults lay higher up in the company. The board of directors hadn't understood their responsibility for safety. They hadn't even asked the most basic question: what orders should we give to keep our ships safe? From the top floor of the boardroom to the lowest rung of management, there had been no proper comprehension of duty. The Herald hadn't been properly organised for the Dover-Zeebrugge run, and the entire company, they said, was infected with the disease of sloppiness. That damning conclusion led to criminal charges. It wasn't just a crew's mistake, it was a company's culture. The culture at Townsend Torreson was, in Sheen's words, ripe for disaster, marked by poor communication, toxic relations between ship's crews and management, and a dismissive attitude towards safety concerns, such as repeated calls for bridge door indicators. 7 company officials were charged with gross negligence manslaughter and corporate manslaughter, but the case collapsed when the judge directed the jury to acquit, and no one was ever held criminally responsible for the deaths of 193 people. In the months that followed, Townsend Torreson was rebranded as P&O Ferries, its distinctive orange and white livery quickly repainted. The official report even acknowledged the shift in tone at the top. It is apparent that the new top management has taken to heart the gravity of this catastrophe, and the company has shown a determination to put its house in order. The company's surviving sister ships also got a rebrand. The Pride of Free Enterprise became the Pride of Bruges. The Spirit of Free Enterprise became the Pride of Kent. Both would continue to sail for many years, carrying the weight of a name and a history that would never be forgotten. Dutch salvage specialists Schmidt Tack righted and refloated the Herald within days. A month later, the final bodies were recovered from her wreck. Towed to a shipyard near Zeebrugge, she was briefly put up for sale, with her owners claiming she could sail again. No buyer came forward. By 1988, she was on her final voyage to a scrapyard in Taiwan, where the twisted steel was dismantled. The disaster left behind more than wreckage. It forced changes in ship design and operation that have saved lives since. But for the 193 people who perished just outside Zeebrugge, those changes came far too late. In the aftermath of the tragedy, there were moments of extraordinary heroism that stood out even against the bleakest backdrop. 14 gallantry medals were presented to those who had risked their own lives that night, to crew members who went back into danger, to rescuers who braved freezing waters, and to one man whose courage was unlike anything the inquiry had ever recorded. Passenger Andrew Parker became known as the Human Bridge. When survivors were trapped on the Herald's hull with no safe way across to a waiting tugboat, Parker quite literally lay himself across the gap. One by one, people clambered over him to safety, his body serving as the only link between life and certain death. It was a selfless act, and that left him battered and bruised, but he was still alive, and it saved many others. A permanent memorial at St Mary's Church in Dover honours those who lost their lives, standing as a lasting reminder that they will never be forgotten. It symbolises respect, remembrance, and the deep impact the disaster left on Dover and beyond. The loss of the Herald of Free Enterprise was the deadliest sinking of a British ship in peacetime for more than half a century. 193 people never made it home, their lives cut short not by storm or war, but by complacency, missed chances, and a chain of small failures that became catastrophic. Out of the wreckage came change. New regulations, new systems, and lessons written in the cold sea waters of Zeebrugge. But for the families left behind and the survivors who still carry that night with them, those changes came too late. The Herald is gone now, broken up on the far side of the world, and yet her story endures, a warning that the sea forgives no oversight, and that every voyage depends on the vigilance of those who set sail. Naturally, this was a very, very distressing story of what happened that night, and our condolences go out to the family and friends of those who lost their lives. However, I hope you liked the way the material was presented. I look forward to seeing you on the next one, and I'll bid you goodbye for now.
you.